Hi all, I'm Mr. Mendoza, a second grade teacher at Wave Du Bois Charter Academy. Today I'll be reading Calling the Doves, El Canto de las Palomas. Story by Juan Felipe Herrera, pictures by Elias Simmons. Nací en el pequeño pueblo de Fowler. Hey, hold on. I'm reading to an English audience, so I should read the English portion to this. I was born in the tiny town of Fowler, the raisin capital of the world. My mother and father were farm workers, and I grew up traveling with them through the mountains and valleys of California. This whole book is dedicated to my mother, Lucha, and my father, Felipe, who loved the open sky and the earth when it is tender. They taught me that inside every word there can be kindness. You were born on the road like your father, my mother would tell me this when we had to move on to another labor camp. My mother Lucha, my father Felipe, and me. I would gaze across the fields at the campesinos, the farm workers, as my father drove our old army truck through the back roads of California. In their bright colors, campesinos dotted the land like tropical birds. Think about this. What's a campesino? A person that works out in the campo, in the fields, field worker, laborer. They look like if they're sleeping out in the open. Are they camping? Wherever we stopped, we set up a carpa, a tent. My father would pull out a thick green canvas like a giant tortilla dipped in green tomato sauce. Mama would unroll it while we looked for branches to pin the ends into the ground. We slept huddled together under the blankets and quilts. I would look up and see the stars sparkle through the tiny holes of the canvas. Imagine being out there, sleeping like that, just out in the open. My mother would cook breakfast outside in the open. Huevos con papas, scrambled eggs or fried eggs with potatoes, a frying pan, a griddle to cook the tortillas, and a jar of forks and knives. These were the necessary ingredients, and of course, wood for the fire. The sky was my blue spoon. The wavy clay of the land was my plate. One day, my father decided to build us a one-room house on top of an abandoned car. He hammered 2x4s and plywood onto the old Ford chases and dipped his brush into buckets of white paint. From the distance, my house was a short loaf of bread on wheels. Inside, it was a warm cave of conversations. Mexican songs and auctions blared from a box radio on the wall. Hmm, very crafty dad. One time we visited our friends in Fowler for a couple of months. I took my baths in a giant tin bucket in the middle of the yard, surrounded by four family trailers. While she scrubbed my arms, my mother sang about Mexicanos crossing the Texas border. I hummed along and splashed the water. A thin wooden Protestant church leaned to one side behind the trailers. Our dirt patio was a sand-colored theater where I learned to sing. Taking a bath outside, huh? Life of a campesino, the life of a migrant worker. At noon, on a lunch break from driving the tractor, my father made bird calls. He would put his hands up to his mouth and whistle deeply as if he had a tiny clarinet inside the palms of his hands. This is how a dove sings, my father would say. Sooner or later, A real dove would fly in and perch itself on a nearby tree. Let me see if I can make that sound. My mom taught me how to do that. Calling of the doves. Sometimes my mother, what are they eating? Sometimes my mother would surprise us at dinner by reciting poetry. Over a plate of guisado, a spicy tomato stew, and a hard flour tortilla, she'd rise to her feet with her hands up as if asking for rain. Rhyming words would pour out of her mouth, and for a moment the world would stop spinning. I guess she was good at poems and poetry and singing, obviously. After dinner and after our traveling chickens had gone to roost, my father would play the harmonica and tell stories about coming to the States from Chihuahua, Mexico. My mother died while giving birth, and my father died from hard labor, he would say. I was only 14 when I jumped the train to come to the United States, to El Norte. I heard how I could ride horses in Wyoming, but when I got there, it was so cold that my spit turned to ice when it hit the ground. He went to Wyoming. What in the world were he doing in Wyoming? Especially in the winter where it's freezing cold. My mother was a healer. When a fast sparrow would crash into our square house, Mama would pick it up gently and rub its head with alcohol and eucalyptus tea. Sometimes she would visit the neighborhood children who went sick for a fever, she would tell me. You need plantillas for the feet. First, you mix shortening and baking soda in a bowl. Then you rub this on the legs and feet. Gently, you wrap the feet with newspapers. In the morning, cool and surprised, the children would jump out of bed in their squeaky paper boots. My mom still makes some of these medicines. This is how they learn when they don't have a doctor around. They take care of themselves in Mexico. I love the illustrations on this. The road changed with the seasons. In the winter in Delano, my parents trimmed grapevines. By springtime, we headed to Salinas for the picking of melon, lettuce, and broccoli. When summer began, we drove back to Delano and Parlier to prune the grapes so that a few would grow the sweetest. By the end of the summer, as the leaves turned colors, we traveled through the valley, picking the grapes. We laid them out on the ground to dry on long sheets of paper between the vines. In time, with the sun, the tiny, fiery plants would stop glowing and shrink into dark raisins. I used to remember doing that, and that was ugly, sweaty, dirty, bunch of insects flying all over the place. Ducks, turkeys, geese. In the mountain valleys around Lake Wolfer, my father would get paid in sacks of sweet potatoes and buckets of fresh water fish instead of money. He worked for old retired people like Mr. Kelly, the Irishman, who paid him with live rabbits, and Mrs. Jameson, who paid him in trays of corn biscuits. Instead of toys, he would bring home bags of avocados and flying turkeys. The turkeys shook their red noses and flapped their peppery feathers and ran after me. Imagine getting paid with those things. I think it's more of a bartering system than anything else. I love the night. Can you hear the wolves in the mountains? My mother would ask me. The wolves were the mountain singers. I imagined them sniffing at the moon in long howls and high notes. They cried in the dark like lost children. I would cup my hands to my mouth and join them. A fiesta in the mountains was a rare treat. The other campesinos would invite us. They worked as gardeners like my father or housekeepers like my mother. We would gather under a large carpa as big as a circus tent, huddled up against the mountain slope. I remember stove fires, guitars, and my father's harmonica, and sweet tortillas the size of my hand that tasted like licorice candy. The men would lift me up in their arms and offer me churros con canela y azúcar, Mexican donuts with cinnamon and sugar. It was a homemade city of brown faces with smiles and music. They were very festive. It doesn't matter if you're traveling and you don't have much money. Look at all this beauty in there. I mean, that's the truth behind our culture, Mexican culture. The truth is that joy does not come from money. Time to settle down. It's time Juanito goes to school, my mother finally said to my father. I was 8 years old and I had gathered the landscapes of the valley close to my heart. My father curling a tractor around the earth, my mother holding her head up high with song. Our little square loaf house swerved down the spiral of the mountains and into the cities of Southern California. As the cities came into view, I knew one day I would follow my own road. I would let my voice fly the way my mother recited poems, the way my father called the doves. He started dreaming at 8. This is beautiful. Dedicated to the memory of Cesar Chavez and in honor of the work of the United Farm Workers Union. For John and Maralisa with love, Eli Simmons. Here's a very small picture of their truck and them. Beautiful illustration. Juan Felipe Herrera was one of the most prominent Mexican American poets writing today. Is one of the most prominent Mexican Americans poets writing today. The award-winning author of of 5 books of poetry, he is also an actor, a musician, and a popular professor at California State University at Fresno. Maybe he still is. He lives with his family in Fresno, California. Maybe he still does. Who knows? I think this was back in 1999, so that was 20 years ago. Eli Simmons is an internationally exhibited painter. Her first picture for children's book press, Magic Dogs of the Volcanoes by Manlio Argueto, was highly praised for its rich colors and magnificent imagery. She lives with her family in Lagunitas, California. Hopefully you enjoyed this about farm workers, campesinos traveling the state and maybe even a few states, calling the doves. El canto de las palomas.